A man named Koporolu Mehmet Pasha walked into a meeting in 1656 and made a demand that no one in his position had ever made before. He said, "I'll take the top job, but I answer to no one in the palace. No factions, no interference. Total authority over appointments. Take it or leave it." The person across the table from him was a woman, a former slave, the mother of a child emperor. She said yes. That decision stabilised the Ottoman Empire for another generation, and almost no one knows her name. This is the story of how the most powerful empire in the world spent 120 years being run by women the history books wrote off as a scandal, and why, if you look at the actual mechanics, they were the only thing holding it together. Every empire needs a succession plan. The Ottomans had one. It was brutal, it was deliberate, and for about a century, it worked. Not because anyone changed it, but because the logic that made it functional eventually consumed the very thing it was supposed to protect. Let's start with the fatal flaw, the fratricide law. In the late 15th century, Mehmet II formalised it. When a new sultan takes the throne, his brothers were executed. The justification was explicit. For the sake of the good order of the world. This wasn't secret or shameful. It was policy written down, legally sanctioned. But why would anyone do this? The Ottomans had looked around the world and looked at history. The Ottomans had watched other dynasties tear themselves apart in succession wars. Fratricide was brutal, but it was faster and cheaper than civil war. One bad week at the start of a reign versus years of conflict. The sums were cold, but made sense. But this led to a problem that built up slowly. By the late 16th century, mass fratricide had become politically toxic. Mehmet III had 19 brothers executed on the day he took the throne. 19. The public reaction was severe enough that the practice had to stop. And here's where the cafes, or cages, come in. Instead of killing surplus princes, the Ottomans began confining them to a guarded suite of apartments in the palace. No contact with the outside world, no administrative roles, no provincial governorships, no experience of anything resembling governance. Before the cafes, Ottoman princes were sent to govern provinces. They ran budgets, managed armies, dealt with local disputes. By the time they became sultan, they had years of practical experience. The cafes ended all of that. Mustafa I, described by contemporary observers as soft in the head and unsuited to rule, he was deposed twice. He had spent years in confinement before anyone asked him to run an empire. Suleiman II had been in the Boxwood apartment, the cafes, for 40 years. 40 years. When they came to tell him he was now sultan, he cried. He thought he was being taken out to be executed. The Ottoman chronicler, Mustafa Ali of Gelibolu, identified the problem directly. The withdrawal of the sultan from public life left him unaware of the condition of the people, and allowed palace favourites to meddle in state affairs. This wasn't hindsight. People saw it happening. So here's what the Ottomans had built by the early 17th century. A system that deliberately prevented its own rulers from learning how to rule. The cafes wasn't a flaw someone introduced by accident. It was a solution to one problem, killing your own brothers, that created a much larger one. You now had sultans ascending the throne with no administrative experience, no political networks, no understanding of the military or the treasury. The machine needed an operator. That's the vacuum. Now let's talk about who filled it and how. When people think about women exercising power in the Ottoman harem, they usually imagine something like whispered influence, pillow talk, manipulation, working through men. But that framing is doing a lot of work to minimize what was actually happening. Because the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, wasn't operating in the shadows. She had formal channels, financial resources, and documented political authority that would be recognizable in any modern power structure. The first to officially use the title Valid Sultan, or Mother Sultan, was Nurbanu Sultan. And it wasn't a courtesy title like it is in, say, the English royal family. It came with the highest daily allowance in the empire, 3 times the Sultan's own. The financial architecture of the institution was built to support political action by the person in this role. And when a sultan came to the throne as a kid, which happened repeatedly during this period, the Valid Sultan acted as a regent. Qasem Sultan served as a regent for Murad IV, then for Ibrahim, then for Mehmed IV. This is not informal influence, this is the head of the state. The Valid Sultans wrote directly to the Grand Viziers to direct policy. The Grand Viziers were the head of the political establishment. These letters survive. They are not suggestions. They read like instructions, because they were. Foreign envoys knew that gaining the Valid Sultan's favour was essential to any negotiation. Nurbanu Sultan's influence was so high that the Venetians, experienced cynical operators who had been dealing with the Ottomans for generations, specifically looked to work with her. You don't do that for someone with no real power. When a sultan was going to be deposed, which required a religious ruling, the Sheikhul Islam consulted the Valid Sultan. The Sheikhul Islam was an extremely revered scientist in the Ottoman system. The Valid Sultan had a formal role in the most extreme act of Ottoman constitutional politics, removing a sitting ruler, often their own son. when it comes to the military and infrastructure. The Turhan Sultan didn't just advise on the Dardanelles fortifications, she underwrote it. She paid for it. She was directing military expenditure during an active crisis. And this is the part that the decline narrative gets completely backwards. It's looked at as women running the empire and reads weakness. What it's actually seeing is a system rooting around a broken component. The sultans couldn't govern. The institution of the Valid Sultan, with its stipends, its formal regency powers, its diplomatic recognition, its control over appointments, was the load-bearing wall that kept the structure upright. Remove the women and you don't get stronger sultans, you get faster collapse. But knowing the architecture is one thing, watching it work in practice is something else entirely. Let's put some names to this, because one of the ways this period gets dismissed is through abstraction, harem influence, palace intrigue, language that makes it sound like gossip rather than government. So let's be specific. 4 women, 4 sets of decisions, 4 sets of consequences that shaped the empire. The Hurrem Sultan, the one most people have heard of, and the one most often reduced to the story of how she seduced Suleiman. Here's what she actually did. She influenced the execution of Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who had been Suleiman's closest advisor for 13 years. She then worked to position her own sons in the succession, which ultimately contributed to the execution of Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by another woman, and the most experienced candidate for the throne. You can debate her methods and her motives. You cannot argue she wasn't operating at the highest level of imperial politics. She also wrote directly with the King of Poland, a slave-born woman from the harem conducting foreign policy with European monarchs. Now let's look at Nurbanu Sultan, mother of Murad III, and the woman who institutionalized the role. She didn't just exercise power, she formalized it. She took the title, established the financial structures, built the diplomatic relationships. The Venetians weren't doing her a favor by cultivating her. They were cultivating her because she was the most reliable access point to Ottoman decision-making during Murad III's reign. Murad III was, by most accounts, not a particularly engaged ruler. Nurbanu was. Now on to Kosem Sultan, the most durable political operator of the entire period. She served as regent across 3 separate reigns. Think about what that means. She was central to Ottoman governments for decades. She was instrumental in the succession of Mustafa I. She was consulted by the Sheikhul Islam on depositions. She outlasted multiple grand viziers, multiple crises, multiple factional realignments. She was strangled in the palace in 1651 at the order of her own daughter-in-law, Turham, is itself evidence of how seriously her power was taken. You don't assassinate someone who isn't a genuine threat. And finally, Turhan Sultan. And this is the one that closes the argument. Turhan Sultan was regent for Mehmet IV during the worst crisis of the mid-17th century. The treasury was depleted. The military was demoralized. Factional violence in Istanbul had become routine. And what did she do? She made a decision that would give the empire what it needed most: stability. And this decision was made by a woman who had also been born a slave. These are not women who stumbled into power or charmed their way into decisions. These are women who understood the system they were operating in, identified what it needed, and delivered it, repeatedly across decades, under conditions that would have broken most rulers. The Sultanate of women wasn't a scandal. It was the empire's immune response. Which raises the obvious question. If it was working, why did it end? Here's the version of this story you'll find in a lot of textbooks. The Sultanate of women was a symptom of Ottoman decline. And when strong men reasserted control in 1656, the empire stabilized. That reading makes the women the problem and Koporolu Mehmet Pasha the solution. But look at what actually happened, and the story runs in the opposite direction. By the early 1650s, the structural vacuum that had produced the Sultanate of women had evolved into something more chaotic. The Grand Vizierate itself had been destabilized. Multiple Grand Viziers in a short period. Factional violence. The Janissaries running riot. Turhan Sultan, as the regent for the young Mehmet IV, was the most powerful figure in the empire. She was operating in a system that was becoming ungovernable even for her. But her solution was not to hold on to power at any cost. Her solution was to find someone who could exercise executive authority cleanly, without the factional complications that came with palace politics. She identified Koporolu Mehmet Pasha, and his demand was simple. He would only accept the Grand Vizierate on the condition of absolute authority. Total control over appointments, no interference from other statesmen, no interference from the palace. In some ways, this was a strange document. A Grand Vizier demanding independence from the harem tells you exactly how much the harem had been running things. But Turhan agreed to the conditions. She underwrote the appointment. She stepped back. And the result? Koporolu Mehmet Pasha stabilized the empire. He executed hundreds of opponents, restored military discipline, rebuilt the treasury. The empire did not collapse in 1656. It recovered. Now ask, who made that recovery possible? Not Koporolu alone. Turhan Sultan identified him, appointed him, and gave him the authority he needed to act. The recovery was her decision as much as his execution. The instability was caused by the cafes producing sultans that couldn't govern. The harem filled the gap. When a strong enough executive could be found outside the palace to fill that gap, The harem handed it over. That's not decline, that's functional political adaptation. The Sultanate of Women ended in 1656 because Turhan Sultan solved the problem it existed to manage. She found a capable executive, contracted his authority, and transferred the load-bearing function from the harem to the Grand Vizierate. The system didn't recover despite the women, it recovered through the last decision one of them made. And if you're still inclined to call this period a symptom of decline, consider this. The empire lasted another 2.5 centuries after 1656. The load-bearing wall held. So let's bring this back to the Ottoman picture, because the Ottoman case isn't just interesting history. It's a template for how power actually works inside broken systems. Here's the thing about the decline narrative. It's not unique to the Ottomans. It shows up everywhere. Empire weakens, unconventional actors fill the gap, and the conventional reading blames the unconventional actors. It's a pattern, and it's almost always wrong in the same way. The fratricide law solved a real problem, succession wars, but created a worse one. Rulers with no governing experience. The cafes solved the political cost of fratricide, but deepened the governance cost. Every solution generated a new structural failure. The women didn't cause this cascade, they were downstream of it. They filled the vacuum because proximity incentive aligned. They were the people closest to power, with the most to lose if the empire collapsed. Their sons were on the throne. Their survival was tied to the empire's survival. That's not just naked ambition, that's rational behavior inside a broken system. The decline narrative works by identifying who was in the room when things went wrong and blaming them. But that's not how these kind of systems fail. Systems fail because of structural incentives that made bad outcomes rational for the people inside them. The Ottoman sultans weren't weak because women were running the empire. Women were running the empire because the sultans were weak. And the sultans were weak because the cafes had been designed to keep them that way. This is the pattern. The system creates the vacuum gets filled by whoever is positioned to fill it, and the people who fill it get blamed for the vacuum. The actual case, the structural design that created the gap, goes unreformed. We see this in colonial administration, in post-independence government failures, in modern institutional breakdowns. The people visible at the point of failure are rarely the people who built the conditions for failure, but they're the ones who end up in the history books as the explanation. The Sultanate of Women lasted roughly 120 years. It produced some of the most capable political operators in Ottoman history. It ended when the women running it appointed someone else to do the job more efficiently and stepped aside. And the lesson isn't about women in power. It's about what happens when you design a system that breaks its own operators and acts surprised when someone else has to pick up the load. The women of the Ottoman imperial household weren't the weakness in the machine. They were the reason the machine kept running. The weakness was the cafes. The weakness was always the cafes. And this strange and misunderstood part of Ottoman history definitely isn't the only century-long period where the structure of power started to crumble. The Catholic Church corroded itself to the point that at one stage there were 3 people calling themselves Pope at the same time. Watch this to see how medieval Europe solved the 3-Pope problem, but tore Christianity apart in the process. When they knew the first to officially use Valid Sultan, or the first to officially use the Nurbanu Mother Sultan was Nurbanu Sultan.